The first day on the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, was the opening day of the Battle of Albert, the name given by the British to the first 2 weeks of the Battle of the Somme. 9 corps of the French 6th Army, the British 4th and the 3rd Armies, attacked the German 2nd Army of General Fritz von Bülow. From Foucaulcourt south of the Somme northwards to Serre, north of the Ancre, and at Gommecourt, which was 2 miles beyond, in the 3rd Army area. The objective of the attack was to capture the German 1st and 2nd positions from Serre south to the Albert-Bapaume road and the 1st position from the road south to Foucaulcourt. The German defence south of the road mostly collapsed and the French had complete success on both banks of the Somme, as did the British from Maricourt on the army boundary, where 13th Corps took Montauban and reached all its objectives, and 15th Corps captured Mametz and isolated Fricourt. The 3rd Corps attack on both sides of the Albert-Bapaume road was a disaster, making only a short advance south of La Bosselle, where the 34th Division had largest number of casualties of any Allied division on the 1st of July. Further north, the 10th Corps attack captured the Leipzig redoubt, failed opposite Thiepval, and had a great but temporary success on the left flank, where the German front line was overrun by the 36th Division, which then captured Schwabin and Stuff redoubts. German counter-attacks during the afternoon recaptured most of the lost ground north of the Albert-Bapaume road, and fresh attacks against Thiepval were costly defeats. On the north bank of the Ancre, the attack of 8th Corps was another failure, with large numbers of British troops being shot down in no man's land. The 7th Corps diversion at Gommecourt was also costly, with only a partial and temporary advance south of the village. The German defeats from Foucaulcourt to the Albert-Bapaume road left the German defence on the south bank incapable of resisting another attack, and a substantial German retreat began from the Flaucourt plateau to the west bank of the Somme close to Péronne, while north of the Somme, Fricourt was abandoned overnight. Several truces were observed to recover wounded from no man's land on the British front, where the 4th Army had lost 57,470 casualties, of whom 19,240 men were killed. The French had 1,590 casualties and the German 2nd Army lost 10,000–12,000 men. Orders were issued to the Anglo-French armies to continue the offensive on the 2nd of July, and a German counter-attack on the north bank of the Somme by the 12th Division, intended for the night of 1/2 July, took until dawn on the 2nd of July to begin and was destroyed. Since the 1st of July 1916, the cost of the battle and the meagre gains have been a source of grief and controversy in Britain, in German and French writing. The first day of the Battle of the Somme has been little more than a footnote to the mass losses of 1,914, 1,915 and the Battle of Verdun. Background: strategic developments in July 1915. The French commander-in-chief Joseph Joffre held the first inter-allied conference at Chantilly in December 1915. A second conference resolved to conduct simultaneous attacks by the French, Russian, British and Italian armies. For the British, France and Flanders were the main theatre of operations, and in February 1916, Haig accepted Joffre's plan for a combined attack astride the Somme River, around the 1st of July. In April, the British cabinet accepted the necessity of an offensive in France. The nature of a joint offensive on the Somme began to change almost immediately when the German army attacked at Verdun on the 21st of February. In March, Foch proposed a Somme offensive on a 45 km front, between La Cygne and the Somme, and a British attack on a 25 km front, from the Somme to Thiepval, with 42 French and 25 British divisions. French divisions intended for the joint offensive were soon diverted to Verdun, and the offensive was eventually reduced to a main effort by the British, with a supporting attack by one French army. The Somme was to be the first mass offensive mounted by the British Expeditionary Force, and the first battle to involve a large number of new army divisions. many composed of PALS battalions that had formed in response to Kitchener's call for volunteers in August 1914. By the end of the Gallipoli campaign, 12 British divisions were in Egypt, and from the 4th of February to 20th of June, 9 were transferred to France. From Britain and Egypt, the 34th and 35th Divisions arrived in January, the 31st and 46th in February, the 29th, 39th, 1st Australian and 2nd Australian Divisions in March, the New Zealand Division in April, the 41st, 61st and 63rd Divisions in May, the 40th, 60th, 4th Australian and 5th Australian Divisions in June, and the 11th Division arrived on the 3rd of July. The 55th and 56th Divisions were reassembled, a battalion of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment and the South African Brigade joined in April, followed by a contingent of the Bermuda Volunteer Rifle Corps in July. Despite considerable debate among German staff officers, Falkenhayn insisted on rigid defense of the front line in 1916 and implied after the war that the psychology of German soldiers, shortage of manpower and lack of reserves made the policy inescapable, since the troops necessary to seal off breakthroughs did not exist. High losses incurred in holding ground by a policy of no retreat were preferable to higher losses, voluntary withdrawals, and the effective belief that soldiers had discretion to avoid battle. When a more flexible policy was substituted later, discretion was still reserved to army commanders. Despite the certainty by mid-June of an Anglo-French attack on the Somme against the Second Army, Falkenhayn sent only 4 divisions, keeping 8 in the Western Strategic Reserve. No divisions were moved from the Sixth Army, despite it holding a shorter line with 17.5 divisions and having 3 of the reserve divisions in the Sixth Army area. The maintenance of the strength of the Sixth Army, at the expense of the Second Army on the Somme, indicated that Falkenhayn intended the counter-offensive against the British to be made north of the Somme front. Once the British offensive had been shattered, tactical developments in April 1916, Groupe d'Armes du Nord issued an 82-page pamphlet on the stages and processes of an attack on enemy positions prepared in depth, which, as the experience of the offensives of 1915 had demonstrated, would inevitably be costly and time-consuming military operations. The pamphlet was a substantial revision of Note 5779, which had been derived from Bataille Conditions d'un Action Offensive d'Ensemble, compiled from after-action reports of the fighting in 1914 and the foundation of French offensive planning during 1915. The pamphlet revised the emphasis in Note 5779 on decisive battles leading to breakthroughs. Battle would be methodical, until the power of resistance of the defender was broken by moral, material, and physical degradation, while the attacker still had the ability to attack, and that a breakthrough would be unlikely. Coordination of artillery and infantry was fundamental to the process, in which artillery would destroy defenses and then infantry would occupy them. Thus, infantry objectives were to be determined by the range of artillery. Artillery bombardments were to be coordinated with infantry attacks, with various types of artillery given particular objectives for the destruction of field defenses and the killing of the German infantry in them. Heavy artillery and mortars were to be used for the destruction of field fortifications, howitzers and light mortars for the destruction of trenches, machine gun and observation posts, heavy guns and mortars to destroy fortified villages and concrete strong points. Longer-range guns were to engage German artillery with counter-battery fire, to deprive German infantry of artillery support when French infantry were at their most vulnerable during the attack. Wire cutting was to be performed by field artillery, firing high-explosive shells and supported by specialist wire-cutting sections of infantry, which would go out the night before an attack. During the attack, the field artillery would fire a linear barrage at trenches and the edges of woods and villages. Infantry attacks were to be based on reconnaissance, clear objectives, liaison with flanking units and the avoidance of disorganization within attacking units. General attacks would need to be followed by the systematic capture of surviving defensive positions, to create suitable jumping-off positions for the next general attack. In 1915, British tactical thinking had been based on the experience of its Western Front battles, particularly the Battle of Loos in September, and the study of French and German examples, in translated French manuals and pamphlets. The importance of organized artillery firepower and the integration of types of weapons and equipment was recognized. Creeping barrages, smoke screens and cloud gas discharges were to be used along with aircraft trench mortars, Lewis guns and elaborate signals systems, which had been created to counter chronic communication failures, which occurred as soon as the infantry attacked. Troops were to attack in a succession of lines grouped into waves and followed by parties to consolidate captured ground or pass through the leading troops and continue the advance. The 9th Division had attacked at Loos with 4 battalions on a front of 1,600 yards, each battalion in 3 waves, one behind the other. A 2nd Battalion followed each of the leading battalions in the same formation, ready to leapfrog beyond, and a 2nd Brigade followed the 1st as a reserve. 6 lines of infantry, with the soldiers 2 yards apart, had confronted the German defense. Lines and waves had been made thinner and shallower after 1915, and on 14 July 1916, in the attack on Longaville, the division advanced with 4 battalions. Companies were arranged in columns of platoons, creating 4 platoon waves 70 yards apart. 1 brigade attacking with 2 companies of each battalion, 2 more behind and a 2nd battalion following on, so that each section of the front was attacked by 16 platoon waves. 6 platoons had gone forward on a front of about 1,000 yards, roughly 1 soldier every 5.5 yards. On the Somme front, Falkenhayn's construction plan of January 1915 had been completed. Barbed wire obstacles had been enlarged from one belt 5 to 10 yards wide to 2, 30 yards wide and about 15 yards apart. Double and triple thickness wire was used and laid 3 to 5 feet high. The front line had been increased from 1 trench to 3, dug 150 to 200 yards apart. The first trench occupied by sentry groups, the second for the front trench garrison and the third trench for local reserves. The trenches were traversed and had sentry posts in concrete recesses built into the parapet. Dugouts had been deepened from 6 to 9 feet to 20 to 30 feet, 50 yards apart and large enough for 25 men. An intermediate line of strongpoints about 1,000 yards behind the front line was also built. Communication trenches ran back to the reserve line, renamed the second line, which was as well built and wired as the first line. The second line was beyond the range of Allied field artillery, to force an attacker to stop and move the guns forward, before assaulting the line.